Good day and welcome to this webinar on the impact of gravity on bone and muscle. I'm Dominique Pierrot, Science Manager at IOF, and I'm the moderator of this webinar. Before introducing the speaker of the day, I would like to encourage you to ask questions during the webinar by typing them in the Q&A box, and I will voice them to the speaker towards the end of this webinar. This being said, I have the great pleasure today to welcome Professor Bess Dawson-Hughes, who is Director of the Bone Metabolism Laboratory at the Jean Meyer USDA Human Nutrition Research Center on Aging at Tufts University, and Senior Scientist and Professor of Medicine at Tufts University School of Medicine in Boston. She is the General Secretary of the International Osteoporosis Foundation and the former president and trustee of the National Osteoporosis Foundation in the USA, now BHOF. She is a founding director of the Center for the Advancement of Science in Space. Her research interests include dietary and hormonal determinants of bone and muscle mass and function, acid-base balance of the diet, calcium and vitamin D nutrition, and the prevention and treatment of osteoporosis. Professor Dawson-Hughes is the author of more than 450 peer-reviewed articles. She is a recipient of many awards for her research and scientific leadership, including the IOF President's Award and the CSM Medal of Achievement. Thanks again, Professor Dawson-Hughes, for having accepted our invitation to present today. And now we are listening to your presentation.
Thank you, Dominique. I would like to start this webinar with a short part of an interview I was fortunate to have with a European Space Agency astronaut, Samantha Cristoforetti. Following that, I will resume with my part of the webinar. So I'd like to welcome Samantha. Thank you.
It is a great pleasure to speak with you, a European Space Agency astronaut, Samantha Cristoforetti.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Can you describe a typical day on the space station?
Yeah, absolutely. So we start the workday around 7:30 in the morning with a meeting, like many of us do in the office maybe. But it's a special meeting because it goes over space-to-ground radio, and we have a chat one by one in sequence with all the control centers around the world who are responsible for operations on space stations. So we start with Houston, then Huntsville, who is responsible for the NASA science. And then we move over to Munich in Germany for the European activities on board, then over to Tsukuba in Japan, and then back to Moscow for the Russian activities. And then we all go off and start our day. And every day is actually a little bit different, right? Depending on what you're scheduled for. You might be scheduled for a very major payload, a very big science activity where you're spending all day just doing that. Or you might have a very fragmented day where, I don't know, maybe this experiment just needs you to go over there and flip a switch or change a sample, and it's just a short 20-minute activity, and then you move on to the next. Mm-hmm. Plus, of course, there might be days where you're busy with maintenance, with maintaining the station up and running. Or you are unloading or loading visiting vehicles, like doing all that logistics activity that doesn't sound very glamorous, but of course it's also needed.
How long have you spent on the space station on your longest trip?
So my longest trip was my first one, was about 200 days. And my second one was close to that, about 170. So overall, space station has been my home for a little over a year.
Wow, that's remarkable. Can you describe the exercise program that you and the other astronauts undertake?
Yeah, absolutely. So we all have 2.5 hours in our day set aside for exercise. In principle, every single day, of course, if you're really feeling tired or not that well on a day, you're free to take a day off, but the time is blocked in your work schedule and on the exercise machines for you to work out 2.5 hours. A big chunk of that is resistive exercise. I call that weightlifting and weightlessness, which sounds very easy, right? An easy win. But we have this amazing machine. It's called the ARED, the Advanced Resistive Exercise Device, which is able to provide quite significant loads. Big guys, they can, do their squats with as many pounds as they can lift. It goes all the way up to 600 pounds. And so you can do your squats, your deadlifts, your bench presses, your shoulder presses, like really exercise at least all the major muscles. And that, of course, is incredibly important for bone health. And then we have a second part, which is cardiovascular training. And there we alternate between the treadmill and the cycle ergometer. So the treadmill really allows you to run. It feels quite different, of course, because you're weightless, so your legs are weightless. And in order to keep you in place on the treadmill and not just have you float away at the first contact, you have to wear a harness, and that is tied with a chain to the sides of the treadmill. And depending how long you make that chain, it's going to press you down with more or less force. And you feel that force kind of like, if you were doing a walk with a heavy backpack, you can kind of adjust the harness so that you can distribute that load between your shoulders and your hips. But still, not the most comfortable and pleasant way of running. And then the cycle ergometer, it also feels a little bit different from the mechanics of it. Again, your legs are weightless, so it feels a little bit different in terms of efforts. But other than that, you're biking, you're not sitting, so there's actually no seat. You're just attaching your feet to the pedal, or your biking shoes to the pedal, and you bike away.
Let's talk about meals on the space station. Are you able to, and are most of the astronauts able to eat the food that has been prepared for them? Is it too much food, too little? How will people on the ground know what you're eating? This is important to be able to assess whether or not you're meeting nutritional requirements.
Right, yeah, absolutely. And they rely on our reporting. And there is a dedicated app for that. It's a recent addition to Space Station. So we now all have a tablet assigned to us, and there is this app loaded on our personal tablet. And we are able fairly easily, it's quite user-friendly, to record everything we eat, either, selecting from a pull-down menu or scanning the barcode. Pretty much everything that we have on Space Station has a barcode attached to it. And so not only they can see it on the ground, and so, your flight surgeon can talk to you if they see that, there's a trend towards not meeting nutritional requirements, but you actually also have an immediate feedback. You can see yourself whether you're meeting your caloric requirements, whether you have a good balance of macronutrients, whether you're getting enough micronutrients. So it's a pretty immediate feedback that you have, which I think is the most valuable aspect of it.
That sounds great. Now, in terms, it's well known that historically bone loss occurs certainly in the early astronauts. But the exercise program, the nutrition, and all are very helpful. It still would seem important to not send up into space an astronaut who had fragile bones, because it would be risky even today. So how is that monitored in the astronaut program?
Yeah, first of all, at selection, of course, we tend to select people who are still fairly young, typically, in their 30s or maximum their early 40s. But there's definitely a DEXA scan done through the selection to make sure that they're not already, too weak in their bones for their age. And then this is constantly monitored. Periodically, we have our DEXA scans, and certainly when you're assigned to a space flight, then you will have I think multiple ones, including one very close to flight, also as a baseline, to serve as a baseline to see, what happens to you during flight. and then of course after you return to Earth. And after that, it's really based on need, right? If you see that there was a significant bone loss, then they would probably recommend you having another one to see if that at least partially fixed itself.
Good. Well, I would like to thank you. I'd like to thank the European Space Agency for this opportunity to have a real live astronaut here to discuss what it's like on the space station.
Yeah, thank you. It was such a pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, well, that was certainly an interesting opportunity for me, and I hope that you enjoyed hearing from Samantha Cristoforetti. This brings us to the next part of this program, which is that I will discuss and show some data describing changes in protocols that have resulted in protecting bone and muscle in space. And then we'll look at how those takeaway messages can be applied and are being applied on Earth to address the huge problem of bone and muscle loss in older people, and particularly in those at bed rest. First, a word about the space station history. The ISS, the current space station, has been occupied since November 2000. It is managed by NASA and shared with the European, the Japanese, and the Russian space agencies. It's not the first space station. The first one was Mir, which operated between 1986 and 2001. It was managed by the Soviet Union until the end of 1991, and then by Russia. We're going to look at the losses that occurred in the early astronauts, review those countermeasures in some detail that have been progressively applied in space, and then again consider how they relate to the problems we're having on Earth with bone and muscle. This describes the bone loss in the that was taking place on Mir in 28 to 31 astronauts. And you will see that over the period of 4.5 to 7 months, they were losing an average of 6% from the spine and a scary 8.5% from the hip on these space flights. Fortunately, this was documented very carefully, and it was recognized at the time that if there's any hope for long-term space flight, Mars flights and others, that this problem has to be corrected. Bone loss with disuse occurs by several different mechanisms. One is that there is an increase in sclerostin, which increases the death rate or apoptosis of osteoblasts and results in less bone formation. At the same time, osteocyte death increases, and the lacunar mineralization occurs with little micro areas of petrotic bone. And a common feature of disuse is extreme increase in cortical bone porosity. We can look at the cartoons of this, looking in the upper panel at disuse, where we see the osteocyte apoptosis and sort of a lot of osteoclastic resorption with a very inadequate osteoblastic response, resulting in less mineralized bone. And with heightened loading, you can really reverse the sequence such that you get a lot of osteoblast formation and mineralization. So loading is going to be the first strategy that is applied in space to deal with the bone loss problem. Let's look at the muscle loss that occurred in the early Mir astronauts. Now, this is not over 4.5 to 7 months, but in only 8 days of space flight, we see the biggest losers are the paraspinous muscles, losing more than 1% of their muscle area by MRI per day. The hamstrings, the big resistance muscles, go down 8%. The quads a little less at 6%, the calf at 6%. Some biopsy work has shown that it's the type 1 endurance fibers that atrophy disproportionately to the type 2 fiber, fast twitch fibers, and that the flexors atrophy more than the extensors. To look at the consequences, this is an experiment in the rat soleus, one of the big flexor muscles, before and after 14 days on Mir. And basically, the rats had increased fatigability. In other words, they couldn't maintain their initial contractions with the same force that they had pre-flight. So clearly exercise is going to be on the space station is going to be the first line of pursuit. And in fact, the regimen that Samantha described was put in place years ago. And resistance exercise, squats, heel rises, deadlifts for 30 minutes, 6 days a week, and then aerobic exercise on the cycle or the ergometer or the treadmill for the same amount of time, 6 days a week. And these resistance exercises were designed to target the musculoskeletal sites most adversely affected. The initial effort was in the form of the interim resistive exercise device, the so-called IRED. And it was used on the space station from 2000 to 2008. It allowed loads for the lifts and whatnot of almost 300 pounds. Since 2009, the ARED, a more robust resistive device, was employed on the space station. And it allows loads of twice the IRED, up to 600 pounds. Here's a picture of the ARED, the currently used one, and it employs vacuum cylinders to simulate the free weights for resistive exercise. Here's another example. We saw Samantha on these instruments. Here's the treadmill with the harness around the shoulders of the astronaut who is chained to the treadmill so that he doesn't float away during the exercise program. Let's look at the changes in bone mineral density that occurred in 13 astronauts, 8 of whom used the IRED and 5 used the newer ARED resistive device for 4 to 6 months. If you focus on the 2 right-hand columns, we'll look at percent change in bone density with the IRED. Pelvis -8, femoral neck -6, and other hip sites similar, -4% at the spine. These are very worrisome losses. Look at the benefit of increasing the resistive load with the ARED device, where the changes are very, very attenuated and pretty good. Now, dining in space, you saw some wonderful pictures of Samantha having to use a clipboard to hold the food packets so that they don't float off. And she documents what she eats with the use of barcodes on her iPad and so forth. Let's look at the content of protein and calcium. During the years that up 2000 through 2008, during the IRED era, the calories consumed were over 2,000. Protein 1.12 grams per kilo of body weight, calcium 912 milligrams per day. In the ARED era, the calories are up, of course, because the astronauts are working harder. They're burning more calories. And look at the protein intake, 1.39 grams per kilo. That's not far from twice the recommended intake for people on Earth. Calcium intake was up a little bit. All astronauts are asked to take 800 units of vitamin D3 per day. Those who don't like calcium-rich foods are supplemented with calcium tablets as well. There are associations between the protein and the energy intake with change in pelvic bone mineral content in the astronauts, and these are positive and significant. The trends were the same, but there was not significance for the spine and hip sites. But this does illustrate the importance of nutrition in preserving the bone mineral content. So here is sort of the history of from the earliest to the most recent flights. Now we're looking at percent change in bone mineral density per month. And you look at the mirror and the spine on your left, you see the losses on mirror. There are two IREDs, the earlier IRED users and the later. I'm not sure why they showed them in two increments, but they are losing. The spine is pretty well stable currently on the IRED exercise regimen and the nutrition. So same for femoral neck, except that there is a suggestion of some loss going on, continuing to go on at the femoral neck. But overall, a very nice progression. I want to draw your attention to the changes in total lean mass in the astronauts, the 13 again from the IRED and the ARED eras. Looking at the two right-hand columns in highlight, you see, or in bold, you see that the IRED astronauts were losing 2 kilos of lean mass over 4 to 6 months in space. Interestingly, the ARED users are coming back to Earth with 3 kilos more lean mass than they had when they left Earth. So clearly, this is a big success in terms of handling the bone and muscle losses that occur there. Here's the history for lean body mass, starting with on the left with MIR and the 2 IRED cohorts, and then the ARED cohort. So you see that increase. And there's a corresponding decline in fat in the ARED group shown on the right. So they'll come back fitter than they were when they left. And these, again, these changes are per month. So they're quite meaningful. Now let's look at some translation potential of this success story in space on how we're handling corresponding problems on Earth. We're first going to look at just briefly at a summary of the role of exercise in ambulatory older adults in terms of their bone mineral density. And we will then focus on bone and muscle changes seen in adults at bed rest. And then we will look at the contributions that nutrition makes to preserving bone and muscle on Earth. I'm sharing with you a systematic review that was done to inform guidelines by the World Health Organization on the effect of physical activity on bone mineral density in adults age 65 and older. This is a review of 47 clinical trials and 12 observational studies. And you will see the bottom line is that there is a positive effect of exercise in preserving BMD in ambulatory older adults. Not such a robust finding in the same analysis and review and analysis for the hip. A summary of the findings are that spine density increased with moderate certainty, about 17%, but there was no significant change at the femoral neck. There was very low certainty regarding that finding. Importantly, the authors noted that improvement was seen with the 60 minutes of exercise or more 2 to 3 times per week. When we think about muscle, the change in muscle mass that occurs with aging, there is the traditional, shown in the dashed line here, the slow grinding year in, year out loss. But there is the catabolic crisis model, which I think is very, very solid, shows that that this chronic slow loss is punctuated with episodes of disuse. Let's say a person gets pneumonia for a week, is in bed. During that time, they are losing rapidly, as we will see in a minute, and they don't get back to their baseline. And so you get this very much accelerated downward course. So there was a wonderful experiment by Corbijn in which he put astronauts, 11 healthy adults, older, age 67, on absolutely fixed metabolic diets with precise intake every day of nitrogen, and looked at 24-hour urine nitrogen excretion. In the left panel, you see that there was more nitrogen loss. There was net loss in a minor amount. That would represent the chronic loss that goes on in older people. On the right, you see what happened when those people were put at bed rest for only 10 days. And you see in the 6 to 10 day cell there, that they are really losing very rapidly. Here we are looking in that nice Corbijn study where we had the 10 days of bed rest with the 67-year-olds. And this is what happened to their muscle performance during the 10-day period. They lost knee extension torque in the amount of 12 to 13%. Knee flexion, same thing. 4 flights of stairs, ascent power was down similarly. So we're seeing roughly 13 to 14% losses and a similar amount of loss in VO2 max. Massive losses with 10 days of bed rest. In a lovely article that was done to honor the late Douglas Padden-Jones, looking at information from his previous presentations, we're able to look at the effect of leg lean mass following bed rest in relation to age. So the experiments were not done in parallel. but they were for different lengths. In the young people, over 28 days, they lose maybe 400 grams of lean mass. If they're middle-aged, they will lose 2.5 times that amount in half of the bed rest period of 14 days. So with age, there's a huge step up there. 10 days, if you're older, you're losing. And the oldest patients in 4 days will lose 1 kilo of leg muscle mass. This is just stunning and truly horrifying. And if you are in a cast or have an immobilized knee, for example, over 14 days, and you're a healthy, robust young adult, you will lose 5% of the cross-sectional area of your quad in 14 days. And your peak isometric torque in the immobilized leg will be down 25%. Young people can recover these losses when they get moving again, but elders don't quite ever get back to their previous level. So there have been 2 experiments I want to share that I think are especially informative, related to trying to generate exercise devices that would be effective in patients at bed rest. This would be the first of these was a bed rest of 25 young adults, and they were lying in bed with their head tilted down 6 degrees for 90 days. They were randomized to a resistance exercise program every 3rd day. That would be 30 sessions over 90 days, or to a powerful anti-resorptive agent, pamidronate, or to control. Now, the exercise consisted of 4 sets of 7 maximal concentric and 7 eccentric actions in the squat, and 4 sets in the calf press on an ergometer that was rigged at the end of their bed while they were at bed rest. This summarizes the tibial bone mineral density or content by PQCT. And we'll see the resistance group is shown in the dark squares, the black squares, pamidronate in the dashed lines with the X's, and open circles are control. The conclusion from this experiment was that the leg resistance exercise may have attenuated tibial bone a little bit, but the effect was not statistically significant, and certainly pamidronate and control didn't do wasn't helpful at all. This looks at the change in calf and forearm muscle cross-sectional area in the same young adults lying down for 90 days. And here, if you look at the summary of the results on your left, you see that the resistance exercise group lost 17% of the calf muscle area. The pamidronate group lost 25, and the control lost 25. There was a significant reduction in loss with the exercise group, but there was still a lot of loss going on there. Forearm muscle had losses of 6 to 8% in each of the 3 groups, with no trend toward any effect there. The clearly exercising the legs is not going to improve the muscle mass in the arms, I think, is the takeaway. So this experiment is sort of analogous to the IRED exercise regimen on the space station. A little maybe positive, but not enough. So this led investigators, some of whom were the same as in the previous study, to want to ramp up the resistance in bed rest patients. And so they developed a protocol, not 90 days, but 60 days. Again, healthy young adults with their head tilted down 6 degrees. There were 24 adults, mean age 29. And this time they're going to jump and hop. And they're going to have these sessions 48 during 60 days. So instead of every third day, it would be 6 days a week. Now, the rig that was developed for this experiment is a table that has a moving part. The participant is strapped at the shoulders to the table. And the table moves at whatever speed is needed to get to the desired force that the feet will have when they hit a force plate. The force plate has 2 sections. When they jump, the table goes flying down toward the force plate with both feet hitting at the same time. That's a jump. And a hop is when it goes down and one foot hits the force plate. So they can, and then you hop on one leg and then on the other. So the regimen, they have to do a warm-up where they do sub-maximal jumps and hops. And then each training session will consist of 4 sets of 12 jumps, 2 sets of 15 repetitive hops. So this is much more aggressive. And look at the results. First, we're looking at bone mineral content and density by PQCT at 2 tibial sites over the 60 days. On the left, you see the tibia at 38%. That's a highly cortical region of the tibia. And you see preservation in the jumping and hopping and the solid circles, and the controls losing. The more distal tibia, shown on the right, has more trabecular bone in the contribution, but you see the same successful prevention of that loss in the tibia. This is what happened to the lean tissue mass in the jumping and hopping program. There was a minor decline in lean mass at the beginning, and then it held. And they didn't keep losing. And the treatment arm or the jumping arm lost much less than the control. So that was quite successful. And this looks at the knee extension and flexion torque in these young adults. And you see that they did not lose function during this program compared with the controls. So the summary of the findings are that the controls lost on every front, including 40% of their knee extension torque and 29% in peak oxygen uptake, and the exercise group had no significant loss in any of these outcomes. I would like to make an analogy. This is the ARED equivalent as opposed to the earlier tested IRAD equivalent. In closing, I want to just review a few key points related to nutrition and its support in preserving bone and muscle on Earth. As you know, the literature abounds in experiments, and you have to pick and choose. We're going to look at a very fine meta-analysis, in my view, of randomized trials that looked at the effect of calcium and vitamin D supplementation in combination on any fracture and on hip fracture. And you'll see that there was a 6% reduction in any fracture in the upper panel and a 16%, that's tremendous risk reduction in the hip fracture risk. Let's look at how much vitamin D and at the dosing plan here. in all of these studies, there was 800 units of vitamin D given per day on a daily basis, with one exception, and that was the Women's Health Initiative, which administered 400 units per day. Let's look in the same analysis at what was seen in trials that looked at vitamin D supplementation alone. And you will see that there was no significant risk reduction for either any fracture or hip fracture. And if anything, there's a trend, particularly at the hip, toward more fractures with vitamin D. When we look at the supplementation regimens that were used in these different trials, they range widely from 500,000 units once a year, 150,000 units every 3 months, 100,000 units every 3 months in several studies, or every 4 months is still another, and 300,000 a year. So we are talking about intermittent doses for the most part in this collection of studies, high doses here and there. And so we see no benefit and a worrisome trend on the hip fractures. I would like to just point out that we have seen recently in an analysis of our Stop It study here in Boston that the levels of vitamin D achieved, the 25-hydroxy-D levels, during our 3-year trial in 424 older adults, their risk of falling was related to their 25-hydroxy-D levels. And with the fewest falls occurring in the range of about 22 to 40 nanograms per mil. And that was a significant regression. So we have the concern, it needs to be confirmed, that higher D levels are not only not helpful, they may be harmful. And that could relate to more fractures. In fact, the picture on the right is from an observational study in Australia, in which the starting level of 25-hydroxy-D at time A was related to incident fractures over the ensuing few years. And the pattern looks fairly similar to what we're seeing for falls. And that is that you have fewer and fewer fractures as your D level rises into the referent quintile of which had levels of 23.6 to 28.8. And that if you got higher than that range, you are seeing more fractures. Now, as I mentioned, this is a quintile analysis, and so we have no detailed information that will more precisely define that referent or that nadir in fracture risk. It could be broader than 23 to 29, but it's an area that I think needs further investigation. And finally, I will make one comment on the role of protein. This comes from the observational study, the Health ABC study of elders, people aged 70 and older. Here we're looking at their association between their dietary protein intake and their change in lean tissue mass measured by DEXA. And you can see here that in the 5th quintile, there was less lean mass loss over time than there was in those consuming less protein. This is their intake in quintile 5 was 1.1 grams per kilo per day. As you know, the RDA for the general population is 0.8. There are many who believe that a higher protein intake can help to overcome the anabolic resistance that you see with aging. With that, I would like to just make the conclusion that the careful assessments of what was happening to astronaut bone and muscle health in space, and the willingness to modify protocols has resulted in an exercise and nutrition program currently that will preserve bone, muscle, and function and muscle mass during spaceflight. That is a triumph, and it enables people to dream about going to Mars. Without these problems being under control, that wouldn't even be a faint possibility. The same strategies, particularly those recent the bed rest studies that I showed you that have worked in space, appear to work in bedridden patients. And so I think we need to support the broader application of exercise and nutrition interventions in older people in general, and to use what the new learnings for bed rest patients, permanent bed rest individuals, and for those who are only in bed for 10 days. There are ways we now know that they can preserve bone and muscle health during those transient illnesses. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Dawson-Hughes, for this great presentation. I'm sure it was greatly appreciated by our audience. Now we have time for some questions, and I maybe would like to move with the first one. So Professor Dr. Leibovitz is asking if you can give further explanation about the role of nitrogen during the bed rest, one of the bed rest experiment. I think you point out the importance of nitrogen.
Yeah, nitrogen is mainly resides in muscle. And so if you're in negative nitrogen balance, you are losing muscle. In order to use the 24-hour urine nitrogen excretion as an indicator, you must know what nitrogen is being consumed, because that will also, the nitrogen won't get to muscle, some of it will be excreted. And so that's why that experiment was good, was because they used metabolic diets to absolutely fix the nitrogen intake. So when muscle breaks down, it releases nitrogen, and that appears in the urine. That's why it's a good measure under very controlled intake conditions.
Thank you. We have a question from Dr. Ntuvali, who is asking, when you speak about pamidronate in one of the experiments, she's asking whether pamidronate was given prior to the bed rest period or daily during the experiment.
Okay, it was given as a single, I believe it was a 60 milligram dose in that 14 days pre bed rest. So it was on day -14. And that's it's given IV, and it's that's the standard way it was administered, and it was meant to block bone resorption. Turns out it didn't. It wasn't effective in that setting.
Thank you. Another question from Dr. Leibovitz, and this is a big and important question, and you are the expert. So she's asking you if you can review the range of vitamin D3 that is best and most effective.
The range that is best and most effective?
Yes, of vitamin D3.
Yes. It appears from the meta-analysis I showed that 800 units of vitamin D in those many clinical trials, when given with a little bit of calcium, was highly effective. And you know that you'll get into the 25-hydroxy-D range that is recommended by the Institute of Medicine, now called the National Academy of Medicine, of 20 to 50 nanograms per mil. So modest dosing will get most people into the optimum range according to that analysis. And it's the same range that we saw in which you have the fewest number of fallers, fewer people falling over a 3-year period. So to me, this makes a pretty reasonable case for avoiding high dose intermittent doses of vitamin D and using a daily regimen of 800 to 1,000 units. It's enough. As with other nutrients, taking more and more is not better and better. You're going to get a benefit as you reach the optimum range. And then if you keep going higher and higher, you're going to start to see adverse effects. And in this case, those adverse effects appear to be falls and fractures.
Thank you. Somebody is asking your opinion about what's happening to bone and muscle when people are subject to swimming exercise, because swimming is performed in hypogravity environments. So do you think it is different from what happened in space or in bed rest?
It's the same concept. Absolutely. You are more buoyant. You are there's less gravitational force on you in the longitudinal direction. And so swimming, while it's a wonderful cardiovascular exercise, it should not be the only exercise a person does, because it would not provide the impact needed to see the benefits on the skeleton.
Yeah, sure. And there is a question from Dr. Barbosa, who is thanking you for your excellent talk. And she's asking if you have any data of possible increase of lean mass, with denosumab treatment.
I am afraid I don't know of such data. It may very well be there, but I'm not aware of it. Sorry.
No problem, no problem. So I think it's time now to conclude. I would like to thank you all for your participation in this webinar. We will post the recording of this webinar on the IWF website, and you will receive the recording by email next week. I would like really to warmly thank ESA for providing many videos, and ESA astronaut Samantha Cristoforetti for time dedicated to the interview with you, Professor Dawson-Hughes. If you have any questions, comments, please do not hesitate to send them at webinar@osteoporosis.foundation. Thanks again, Professor Dawson-Hughes, for this very comprehensive talk, and goodbye to everyone.